The Armada encountered the Void Swarm at the edge of the Frontier Nebula, where normal space blurred into clouds of ionized gas and stellar debris, and sensors detected the enemy first, but not as individual ships, but as a massive biological presence that stretched across thousands of kilometers, and the creatures moved through space like fish through water, and their bodies rippled with strange bioluminescence that pulsed in patterns no one could understand. Admiral Keithvar ordered the fleet into attack formation, and it was a classical wedge designed to concentrate firepower while maintaining defensive coverage, and the alien commanders positioned their ships with practiced precision, and centuries of military doctrine guided every movement, and the Defiant remained in the rear guard, dismissed as barely relevant to the coming battle. The Void Swarm attacked with horrifying coordination, and the creatures didn't charge blindly into enemy fire as intelligence reports had suggested, and instead they flowed around the Armada's flanks like liquid, and probed for weaknesses while absorbing the initial barrage with apparent indifference, and energy weapons that should have burned through organic matter simply dispersed across their hides, and kinetic rounds passed through them as if hitting water, and the creatures' bodies sealed moments after impact. Keithvar ordered the fleet to tighten formation and concentrate fire, and he was doubling down on traditional tactics, and it was exactly what the Void Swarm wanted, and the creatures began releasing smaller organisms, and each one was the size of a fighter craft, and they swarmed through the densely packed fleet like angry insects, and these smaller entities attached themselves to ships' hulls and released electromagnetic pulses that disrupted shields and sensors. The first ships began falling within 20 minutes of engagement, and a Kronar battleship had its shields collapsed by a dozen attached organisms, and larger Void Swarm creatures emerged from the nebula clouds and tore the battleship apart, and Valonian fighters tried to maintain formation, but found their superior speed useless against enemies that could predict their movements through some form of collective intelligence. Morrison watched the battle deteriorate from the Defiance bridge, and his hands were clenched on his command chair, and everything was happening exactly as he had feared, and the Council's forces were being pulled apart and isolated and destroyed piece by piece, and Admiral Keithvar's commands became increasingly desperate as casualty reports flooded the command network. Danny Wright spoke from the tactical station, and his voice was tight with frustration, and he said they needed to do something and they couldn't just watch the alien ships die. And Morrison replied that they had to wait for the right moment, because if they broke formation now, they would just be another target. And patience was hard, but necessary. That moment came 40 minutes into the battle when the Armada's formation finally collapsed completely, and ships scattered in all directions, and each captain made individual decisions about survival versus continued engagement, and the command network dissolved into chaos as contradictory orders from surviving senior officers clashed with each other. And the 1,000-ship fleet had become 1,000 separate battles, and each one was ending in defeat. Morrison stood from his chair and ordered all hands to battle stations, and he told Lisa to take them into the nebula clouds at maximum stealth configuration, and Pete needed to give him every ounce of power without lighting them up on sensors, and Helen should prepare for casualties, and Danny should load the nuclear weapons that the Council considered primitive and outdated. His crew executed their orders without hesitation, and they had trained for this moment during the journey, and run simulations in secret, while the rest of the fleet focused on traditional tactics, and the Defiant dove into the dense nebula gases, and used the ionized particles to mask their energy signature, and Earth's relatively primitive technology, which the Council had mocked, made them harder to detect than the advanced alien vessels. Through the clouds, Morrison could see the carnage, and the Zephyrim crystalline dreadnoughts were cracking apart under sustained assault, and Kronar battleships fired their last shots before being overwhelmed, and Valonian fighters made suicide runs that accomplished nothing against the adaptive Void Swarm. And Admiral Keithvar's flagship was a magnificent vessel that had survived 100 battles, but now it broke in half as multiple creatures tore into its hull. The Defiant's sensors picked up something the larger ships had missed in the chaos, and the Void Swarm creatures were coordinating through low-frequency pulses that traveled through the nebula gases, and it was an organic communication network that linked them into a single unified intelligence, and the larger organisms were broadcasting these signals and functioning as command nodes for the entire swarm. Danny reported that he could see 3 massive creatures hanging back from the main battle, and they were pulsing with energy. And Morrison pointed at the tactical display and asked if Danny had them locked, and Danny confirmed but warned that if they fired, every Void Swarm creature in this sector would know they were there. Morrison replied grimly that this was exactly the idea, and he ordered Danny to fire all tubes and then get them out of there before the creatures realized what happened. And the Defiant launched 6 nuclear missiles, and they were ancient weapons by galactic standards but carried fusion warheads that Earth had perfected over centuries of careful refinement. The weapons streaked through the nebula gases and moved too fast for the Void Swarm to intercept, and they detonated in sequence, and the 3 command nodes vanished in brief suns of nuclear fire. And for 10 seconds the entire Void Swarm froze as their coordination network collapsed, and the creatures thrashed independently and became confused and directionless. Morrison didn't wait to see the full results, and the Defiant powered through the nebula at maximum speed, and Pete Collins coaxed every bit of thrust from the engines while keeping their energy signature minimal, and behind them, the confused Void Swarm began attacking each other in the absence of clear coordination signals, and it was exactly what Morrison had hoped would happen. The ship emerged from the nebula into clear space, and systems were strained but intact, and Morrison immediately ordered a full sensor sweep and began counting the surviving ships from the Armada. And the numbers were devastating, and of 1,000 vessels, fewer than 50 remained combat capable, and they were scattered across thousands of kilometers and fleeing. In all directions, Lisa Grant reported that they were receiving distress signals, and multiple ships were requesting assistance, and life support was failing, and engines were damaged and crews were evacuating. And Morrison felt the weight of command settle heavier on his shoulders, and every instinct screamed to help. But tactical reality was brutally clear. He ordered her to log the distress signals and their locations, but maintain course because they couldn't save those ships right now, and the bridge crew absorbed this in grim silence, and they understood the logic, but understanding didn't make it easier. And through the viewports they could see distant flashes as more ships died. Danny Wright announced suddenly that they had sensor contact, and there were 4 Void Swarm creatures on an intercept course, and they had spotted the Defiant, and Morrison studied the tactical display, and the creatures were smaller than the command nodes he had destroyed, but still massive compared to his ship, and they moved with purpose and cut off possible escape routes with disturbing intelligence. Lisa observed that the creatures were hunting them specifically, and the swarm had recognized what they did to their command structure, and Morrison replied with a cold smile that this was good. And he asked Danny how many nuclear warheads they had left, and Danny reported 6+ conventional weapons. Morrison asked Pete about their jump drive, and the engineer's voice came through the intercom, strained but confident, and he said the drive was charged and ready, but if they jumped now they would be running blind with no time for proper calculations. And Morrison watched the approaching creatures, and an idea was forming in his mind. The Galactic Council had ruled the stars for 12,000 years, and peace had followed wherever they went. But now something new had arrived from the darkness between galaxies, and it was hungry beyond measure, and nothing could stop it from consuming world after world, and the Council knew they were facing the end of everything they had built. The Void Swarm came without warning, and moved like a living shadow across the galaxy, and every planet they touched became silent and dead within. Days in the Council watched in horror as their border worlds vanished one by one, and desperate calls for help echoed across the communication networks, but no help could arrive in time, and the death toll climbed into the billions. Every species in the Council contributed ships to form an armada, and they gathered 1,000 vessels crewed by the finest warriors the galaxy had ever known, and each ship carried weapons that could crack planets and shields that had never been breached. In 1,000 battles, and the commanders were legends who had won wars that lasted centuries, and they were certain that their combined might would crush any enemy. Humanity was the newest member of the Council, and they had joined only 30 years earlier, and most species still viewed them as primitives who barely understood how to build fusion engines, and the Council military advisors suggested that Earth should send supply ships or medical vessels and nothing more because humans had never fought a real war in space, and they would only get in the way of experienced warriors. Captain Jake Morrison disagreed with this assessment entirely, and he was 42 years old and had spent his entire career in Earth's united defense. fleet, and he had risen through the ranks during the border conflicts with automated mining drones in the outer colonies. And when the council asked for volunteers, he stepped forward immediately and requested permission to lead humanity's contribution to the Armada. The council reluctantly accepted his offer and assigned him command of a mid-sized cruiser called the Defiant, and the ship looked outdated compared to the sleek alien warships that filled the gathering fleet, and most alien commanders barely acknowledged its presence, and some even laughed when they saw the primitive human vessel docking at Nexus Station. Morrison handpicked his crew of 78 men and women from Earth's military academies and veteran spacer families, and each one had been chosen for their ability to think quickly and adapt to impossible situations. And his first officer was Lieutenant Commander Lisa Grant, who had navigated asteroid fields that would have destroyed most alien pilots, and she could thread a ship through spaces that seemed impossibly tight. Chief Engineer Pete Collins could repair a reactor core with spare parts and sheer determination, and he had kept colony ships running long past their designed lifespan. And medical officer Dr. Helen Park had kept colonists alive through plague outbreaks when proper medicine was light years away. And tactical officer Danny Wright had scored perfect marks in every combat simulation Earth possessed, and he could calculate firing solutions faster than most computers. The Armada gathered at Nexus Station, and Morrison watched through the viewports as alien warships assembled in perfect formation. And the Kronar Empire contributed 200 vessels, and each one bristled with plasma cannons that could melt through metal like butter. And the Valonian hierarchy brought sleek fighters that could dance through debris fields at impossible speeds, and the ancient Zephyrim sent crystalline dreadnoughts that hummed with energy, weapons beyond human understanding. Admiral Kethvar commanded the fleet, and he was a towering insectoid warrior from the Kronar Empire, and his carapace was scarred from 100 battles, and during the pre-battle briefing he barely acknowledged Morrison's presence and instead focused on the proven commanders from established military powers. And when Morrison tried to speak, the Admiral clicked his mandibles dismissively. The battle plan was traditional and called for a massive frontal assault designed to overwhelm the Void Swarm through superior numbers and coordinated fire patterns. And these tactics had won battles for thousands of years, and no one questioned whether they would work again. And the alien commanders nodded in agreement and began positioning their ships according to ancient military doctrine. Morrison studied the intelligence reports on the Void Swarm with growing concern, and what he read troubled him deeply. And the creatures were biological ships, and each one was a massive organism that could survive in hard vacuum and manipulate gravitational fields. And they moved in coordinated waves and adapted to enemy tactics within minutes, and traditional fleet formations had failed against them repeatedly. Tried to voice his concerns to Admiral Kethvar, but the alien commander dismissed him with barely concealed contempt, and Kethvar clicked through his translator that humanity had fought nothing but automated machines and themselves, and that strategy should be left to those who had waged war across the stars for centuries. And the other commanders agreed, and Morrison was told to keep his primitive opinions to himself. The Armada departed Nexus Station 3 days later, and it was a display of power that should have inspired confidence, and 1,000 ships representing the combined might of the galaxy's greatest civilizations moved as one toward the advancing Void Swarm, and Morrison kept the Defiant in the rear formations where the Council had assigned all junior members, and he watched the magnificent fleet ahead of him and wondered how many would return. Lisa Grant approached Morrison in his ready room on the 3rd day of the voyage, and she had been reviewing the tactical data and running simulations on Earth's military computers, and her findings were disturbing. And she told him quietly that every historical engagement with the Void Swarm showed the same pattern, and conventional formations were broken apart, and ships were isolated and destroyed, and coordinated tactics fell apart under pressure. Morrison nodded because he had reached the same conclusion, but kept hoping he was wrong. And he called a meeting with his senior staff and sealed the conference room against electronic surveillance, and if they were going to survive this battle, they needed a plan that the Council would never approve, and one that broke every rule of engagement that the alien commanders held sacred. Pete Collins suggested they could use the ship's small size to their advantage and hide in debris fields and nebula clouds, where larger vessels couldn't follow, and Danny Wright proposed targeting command structures instead of engaging in direct combat, and Helen Park reminded them that Earth's nuclear weapons were considered primitive by galactic standards, but they were still devastatingly effective, and Lisa Grant mapped out escape routes and hiding spots throughout the projected battle zone. Morrison listened to his crew and felt pride swell in his chest, and these were people who understood that survival sometimes required breaking the rules, and they weren't constrained by thousands of years of military tradition, and they could think creatively, because humanity had always been the underdog, and they had learned to fight dirty when necessary. The Defiant continued toward the battle, and Morrison knew that everything would change soon, and the Council's mighty armada would face the Void Swarm, and traditional tactics would be tested against an enemy that had defeated them time and time again. And he suspected that the galaxy was about to learn a hard lesson about the cost of arrogance and the danger of fighting the last war instead of the current one. Morrison explained his plan to the crew, and there was an asteroid field 3 light minutes from their current position, and it was dense enough to confuse sensors but navigable if you were good enough, and Lisa would plot them a course through the thickest section, and Danny would deploy proximity mines every 1,000 kilometers on their approach vector, and Pete would prepare for rapid sequence jumps at 3 coordinates that Morrison would send to his station. Pete protested that rapid sequence jumps could tear the ship apart, and the drive system needed time to cool between activations, and Morrison acknowledged this, but pointed out that getting caught by those creatures would also destroy them, and he told Pete to do his best to keep the ship together. The Defiant accelerated toward the asteroid field, and the 4 Void Swarm creatures followed in pursuit. And from Earth's perspective, using natural terrain for tactical advantage was basic warfare, and every soldier learned to use cover and concealment. But from the Void Swarm's biological perspective, which was used to fighting in open space, where their superior mass and coordination provided overwhelming advantage, it was alien thinking. As the Defiant entered the asteroid field, Danny began releasing proximity mines, and each one was no larger than a briefcase, but packed with shaped charges designed to channel explosive force in specific directions, and the mines drifted into concealment among the tumbling rocks, and their simple mechanical triggers made them invisible to the energy-sensing abilities of the Void. Swarm Lisa announced they were entering the dense sector, and her hands danced across the helm controls as she threaded the ship between asteroids at speeds that would have horrified any Council pilot, and she reported that the creatures were still following and closing to weapons range, and Morrison told her to let them get closer because he wanted them committed to the chase. The Void Swarm creatures proved more maneuverable than their size suggested, and they flowed between asteroids with organic grace and began releasing energy pulses and attempted to disable the Defiant's engines with the same electromagnetic attacks that had crippled so many Council ships. But Earth's military designers had hardened their vessels against nuclear electromagnetic pulses, and this made the Defiant far more resistant than its alien counterparts. Morrison ordered Danny to detonate the mines, and a chain of explosions rippled through the asteroid field behind the Defiant, and the shaped charges hurled asteroid fragments at relativistic velocities and turned millions of tons of rock into directed projectiles, and the Void Swarm, creatures which had evolved for open space combat, had no defense against simple kinetic bombardment. 2 of the creatures were shredded immediately and left trails of biological debris floating in the void, and a third was badly wounded and trailed more debris as it tried to retreat, and the 4th creature, which was larger and apparently more intelligent than its companions, dodged through the barrage and continued pursuit. And now it was closing fast with clear hostile intent. Morrison commanded Pete to execute the jump sequence immediately, and the Defiant's drive system engaged with a reality-twisting wrench that threw everyone against their restraints, and space folded around them. And suddenly they were 2 light hours away and emerged near a debris field from the earlier battle, and Morrison gave his crew 5 seconds to recover before ordering the 2nd jump, and then the 3rd, and each one took them farther from the wounded Void Swarm creature and deeper into territory the fleet had abandoned. When the jumps finally stopped, Pete Collins reported with grim satisfaction that the drive system was holding, but he wouldn't want to try that again anytime soon, and they needed at least 6 hours for proper cooldown, and Morrison nodded and allowed himself a moment of relief because they had survived the encounter and proven that the Void Swarm could be fought with unconventional tactics. Lisa asked if there were any signs of other survivors, and her sensors were picking up scattered signals, but they were all running and nobody was regrouping, and the fleet was broken. And Morrison stared at the tactical display and saw the bigger picture, and the void swarm would continue spreading through council space and consume world after world until nothing remained. He ordered Lisa to set course for Nexus Station, and they needed to warn the council about what was coming, and more importantly, they needed to convince them to fight this war the right way. And this would be harder than any battle because the council's pride had been wounded, and they would be looking for someone to blame. The journey back took 5 days, and Morrison spent that time preparing his report and reviewing all the tactical data they had gathered, and Lisa and Danny helped him compile evidence that showed exactly why the Armada had failed, and more importantly, how future engagements could be won. Nexus Station was in chaos when the Defiant arrived, and the command center had received scattered reports from the battle, and each one was more desperate than the last, and of 1,000 ships only 37 had made it back to council space, and most of those were barely functional, and the death toll was staggering and over. 1 million beings representing the finest military minds the galaxy possessed were gone. In a single day, Morrison docked at a secondary berth and avoided the main bays where council officials were processing the survivors, and he needed information before facing the political firestorm that would inevitably follow, and Lisa Grant and Danny Wright accompanied him to the station's tactical center, which was a vast chamber filled with holographic displays showing the advancing void swarm. The creatures had adapted to their victory and split into multiple strike forces that were simultaneously attacking 3 different star systems, and without the Armada to oppose them, nothing stood between the void swarm and the populated core worlds of council space. In panic was spreading faster than the invasion itself. A Kronar officer approached Morrison, and her carapace was scorched from battle damage, and she stated that he was the human captain and the one who destroyed the command nodes, and she asked how his primitive ship survived when their finest vessels fell, and Morrison chose his words carefully and explained that they fought differently, and the void swarm expected certain tactics because that was what they had always faced. The officer told him that the council demanded his presence and they wished to know why humanity's ship returned when so many others did not, and Morrison understood the implication, and he was being called to account for his survival, and many would see it as suspicious that the newest and weakest member had survived while established powers had been destroyed. The emergency council session was tense and bitter, and representatives from 700 species filled the chamber, and many wore traditional mourning garments for the warriors they had lost, and Admiral Kethvar's second-in-command was a younger Kronar officer named Vexlar, and he stood at the center podium trying to maintain order as accusations flew between species. When Morrison entered the chamber, fell silent, and hostile eyes from across the galaxy focused on the human captain who had survived when their own champions had perished, and Vexlar gestured for Morrison to approach the podium, and his mandibles clicked. With barely suppressed anger, Vexlar announced formally that Captain Jake Morrison of Earth had been assigned to the rear guard far from the primary combat zones. Yet he returned, while ships that held the line against the void swarm were destroyed, and he demanded an explanation, and Morrison had prepared for this moment during the journey back, activated a holographic display showing the battle from the Defiant's perspective, and it showed the failed formation and the collapse of coordination and the destruction of command nodes and the tactical withdrawal. And Morrison stated clearly that the Armada was defeated because they fought according to centuries of military doctrine, that the void swarm had learned to counter. Vexlar accused him of fleeing and said that while others died holding formation, Morrison hid in the nebula and ran when the battle turned against them, and Morrison corrected him and explained that they stayed hidden until they identified the enemy's command structure and then they eliminated it. Morrison explained that his actions had disrupted the void swarm's coordination and allowed some of the surviving ships to escape, and if the Defiant had joined the main battle, they would have died just as uselessly as the others in the chamber. Erupted in angry debate, and some council members saw Morrison's survival as evidence of cowardice, while others recognized that his tactics had been the only effective action taken during the entire battle. The arguments continued for hours and went nowhere, and meanwhile the void swarm advanced toward populated systems, and finally Morrison stepped forward and spoke loudly enough to override the translator systems, and he told them they could debate his actions all they wanted. But while they argued, those creatures were moving toward their homeworlds and he hadn't come to defend himself, But to help them win this war, Vexillor spat back, asking what one ship could do. And one primitive human ship against a force that destroyed 1,000 vessels, and he demanded to know what Morrison proposed. And Morrison pulled up a star chart, showing the void swarm's positions and projected vectors, and explained that the creatures were moving in 3 main groups, and each was heading toward population centers. He continued that traditional fleet actions wouldn't stop them because the Council had already proven that, and instead small units, using unconventional tactics and hitting command nodes and disrupting coordination, could work, and a Valonian representative said sadly that they had no fleets left, and the Armada was everything they had, and there were no reinforcements. Morrison replied that they should build new fleets and use fast ships that were heavily armed and crewed by volunteers willing to fight smart instead of fighting traditionally, and they would use hit-and-run attacks and guerrilla warfare and make the enemy fight on their terms instead of the Void Swarm's terms. Vexillor demanded to know who would command this fleet and whether Morrison expected to lead it, despite having fought in exactly 1 battle against the Void Swarm. And Morrison said he wasn't asking to command anything, and he was offering to show them how Earth fought when outmatched, and they should send observers on his ship and let them see how humans operated. And if it worked, they could adopt the tactics, and if it didn't, they had lost nothing. They hadn't already lost. The Council deliberated for 3 more hours before reaching a compromise, and Morrison would be allowed to take the Defiant on a single mission against the Void Swarm forces, and 3 Council observers would accompany him, and there would be a Kronar tactical officer, and a Valonian pilot, and a Zephyrim science specialist, and if he succeeded, the Council would consider adapting his methods, and if he failed, the few remaining Council forces would focus on evacuation rather than resistance. Morrison accepted the terms, and it wasn't ideal, but it was a chance to prove that the war wasn't lost yet, and he returned to the Defiant and briefed his crew on what was coming, and they would have alien observers watching their every move and judging whether human tactics were worth adopting or whether Earth should be dismissed as lucky primitives. The Defiant departed Nexus Station 2 days later with its 3 Council observers, and intelligence reports indicated that one of the Void Swarm strike forces was approaching the Valeria system, and it was a moderately populated colony world with minimal defenses, and the system would fall within days without intervention, and this would add another 1 billion souls to the growing death. Toll Morrison gathered his expanded crew in the briefing room and looked at faces both familiar and alien, and the Kronar observer was Officer Raxka, and she watched him with open skepticism, and the Valonian pilot was named Scylla, and she seemed more curious than hostile, and the Zephyrim scientist's name translated roughly as Whispering Wind, and they radiated quiet analysis through their crystalline form. Morrison began the briefing by displaying tactical data and explained that the Void Swarm heading for Valeria consisted of approximately 40 creatures, and traditional tactics would say they were suicidally outnumbered, but they weren't going to fight traditionally, and instead they would use asymmetric warfare with small unit actions designed to create effects far beyond their actual strength. Whispering Wind chimed in with a voice like crystal harmonics and asked him to elaborate, and Morrison pulled up detailed plans and explained that the Void Swarm coordinated through their command nodes, and they used low-frequency pulses through space dust and ionized gases, and Valeria had 3 large nebula clouds in its outer system, and they were going to use those clouds to their advantage. Over the next 2 days, the Defiant prepared for combat by doing things no Council ship had ever attempted, and they deployed sensor buoys throughout the Valeria system, and created a detection network that would track Void Swarm movements, and they positioned nuclear mines at strategic points in the nebula clouds, and they even sent a message to Valeria's colonial government requesting assistance with a plan that sounded insane but might work. The colonial government was desperate enough to try anything, and they had watched the reports from the Armada's destruction and knew they had no hope of conventional defense, and Morrison asked them to deploy every automated satellite and defense platform they could build in 48 hours. And he didn't care if they were sophisticated, and basic nuclear warheads with simple guidance systems would be enough. When the Void Swarm arrived, they encountered what appeared to be an undefended system, and the creatures advanced confidently because they had learned from thousands of conquered worlds that resistance was futile, and they spread out to begin their consumption of Valeria's orbital infrastructure, and this was exactly what Morrison had been waiting for. The Defiant struck first and emerged from the nebula clouds to launch nuclear missiles at 2 command nodes, and the warheads detonated with perfect precision and eliminated coordination for roughly a third of the Void Swarm force. And before the creatures could respond, the Defiant vanished back into the clouds. Raxka observed from the tactical station, and her mandibles clicked thoughtfully, and she noted that Morrison was using terrain as a weapon, and this was not how space combat was traditionally fought, and Danny Wright replied that this was exactly why it worked. The confused Void Swarm creatures began hunting for the Defiant, but instead encountered dozens of automated defense satellites that Valeria's colonists had rapidly deployed, and the satellites weren't sophisticated and were basically just nuclear warheads with simple guidance systems, but against creatures expecting no resistance, they were devastatingly effective. Scylla was monitoring from the helm station and began to understand what Morrison was doing, and she said that he wasn't trying to destroy them all in one battle, but was making them predictable and forcing them to respond to threats he created, and Lisa Grant confirmed this and explained that in Earth military doctrine, they called it shaping the battlefield, and they were making the enemy fight where and how they wanted over the next 6 hours. The Defiant conducted hit-and-run attacks throughout the Valeria system, and they destroyed 3 more command nodes, and each time withdrew before the Void Swarm could mount effective pursuit, and the creatures' coordination continued degrading, and their sophisticated collective intelligence fractured into smaller and less effective groups. Whispering Wind made detailed observations of the Void Swarm's biology, and discovered something previous Council scientists had missed, and the creatures could adapt rapidly to threats they encountered repeatedly, but struggled with completely novel approaches, and Earth's primitive weapons, including nuclear warheads and kinetic projectiles and simple explosives, were so different from advanced energy weapons that the Void Swarm had no evolved defenses against them. The decisive moment came when Morrison led the remaining Void Swarm forces into a trap, and he used the Defiant as bait, and drew them into a dense asteroid field where Valeria's colonists had positioned hundreds of mining charges, and the creatures were focused on catching the ship that had been harassing them all day, and flew directly into the ambush without realizing the danger. The asteroid field lit up with sequential explosions, and each one hurled rock fragments at the pursuing creatures, and Morrison had calculated the blast patterns precisely, and created overlapping fields of kinetic destruction that the Void Swarm couldn't avoid, and within minutes, the remaining creatures were either destroyed or so badly damaged they retreated into deep space. Valeria was saved, and one colony world defended by a single Earth cruiser and some hastily armed civilian volunteers had driven off a force that should have consumed them in hours, and the colonists broadcast their thanks across every communication channel and celebrated in the streets while Morrison and his crew watched from orbit. The Defiant returned to Nexus Station and found the council chamber filled with representatives demanding to hear the observers' reports, and Raxka spoke first, and her voice carried new respect, and she stated that humans fought warfare as the Kronar fought duels, and they were practical and adaptable and willing to use any advantage available, and they didn't care about glory or traditional honor, but only about winning. Scylla added her assessment and said that human technology was primitive by galactic standards, but they compensated through superior tactics and willingness to take risks, and they fought like cornered predators, which perhaps explained their effectiveness, and Whispering Wind provided the scientific analysis and explained that human military doctrine appeared built around asymmetric warfare principles. The crystalline being continued that humans assumed they would always face stronger opponents and develop strategies accordingly, and against the Void Swarm, which had only encountered conventional forces. This approach was devastatingly effective, and the council debated for hours before reaching a decision, and they would adopt human tactical principles for the continuing war effort. The surviving council ships would be reorganized into small strike groups, and each one would be trained in the methods that had allowed the Defiant to succeed. And Captain Jake Morrison would serve as tactical advisor to the new fleet structure and help design training programs that would teach alien commanders how to think like humans when facing overwhelming odds. Over the following months, the tide of war shifted, and small groups of fast ships using guerrilla tactics and unconventional weapons began hunting void swarm forces throughout Council space, and they couldn't win every battle, and losses continued, but the creatures seemingly unstoppable. Advance was halted and then slowly reversed. Morrison never commanded more than his single ship throughout the entire conflict, and while the Council eventually assembled new fleets and produced thousands of vessels designed around Earth's tactical principles, he remained aboard the Defiant and took the missions that were too dangerous or too unconventional for others to attempt. His crew became legendary among the survivor ships, and stories spread about the human vessel that appeared from nowhere and struck at impossible targets and disappeared before the enemy could respond. And other captains began requesting transfers to serve under Morrison and learn his methods firsthand. But he kept his crew small and refused most volunteers, because the Defiant's effectiveness came from tight coordination and absolute trust. Lisa Grant became the finest combat pilot in Council space and could thread the ship through situations that other helmsmen wouldn't even attempt, and Pete Collins kept the Defiant running far beyond what its original designers thought possible and made repairs under fire that saved their lives dozens of times, and Danny Wright's tactical solutions were studied at military academies across the galaxy. Void Swarm adapted to the new tactics eventually, but by then the Council had learned to adapt faster and kept developing new approaches and borrowed ideas from human military history, and studied ancient Earth conflicts and applied lessons from guerrilla wars and asymmetric struggles and resistance movements. One particular battle became the turning point of the entire war, and Morrison led a strike force of 20 ships against a major void swarm concentration near the Terminus cluster, and they used coordinated hit-and-run attacks over 3 days and destroyed dozens of command nodes and shattered the creature's ability to coordinate across multiple star systems. The victory at Terminus Cluster proved that the Void Swarm could not only be fought but could be defeated systematically, and Council morale surged and new volunteers enlisted in the defense forces, and species that had been preparing to flee instead chose to stand and fight, and the psychological impact was as important as the tactical success. By war's end, the Void Swarm had been driven back to the dark space beyond the galactic rim, and the cost had been staggering, with billions dead and hundreds of worlds damaged, and the Council's faith in their own superiority shattered forever. But they had survived, and more importantly, they had learned. The final Council session recognizing the victory was held 1 year after the Battle of Darkness, and representatives from 700 species stood to honor the crew of the Defiant, and they acknowledged that the Council had sent 1,000 ships commanded by their finest warriors and employing strategies proven over millennia, and all had failed. One human captain with a primitive ship and 78 crew members had found the way to victory not through superior strength, but through unconventional thinking and willingness to break rules that everyone else considered sacred, and Morrison stood before the Council accepting their gratitude with quiet dignity. He thought about all the ships that had fallen in the Battle of Darkness and all the experienced commanders who had died following tactics that should have worked but didn't. And war wasn't about following tradition or proving strength, but about finding solutions no matter how unconventional when survival was at stake. The Council offered Morrison command of their rebuilt military forces and promised him resources beyond anything Earth possessed and access to technology that would make him the most powerful military leader in galactic history. But he declined and said his place was aboard the Defiant with the crew who had trusted him when no one else would. Vexler, who had once accused Morrison of cowardice, now stood and spoke in his defense, and the Kronar officer said that Morrison had taught the galaxy a lesson they should never forget, and that strength came in many forms, and sometimes the smallest force wielded with intelligence and creativity could defeat the largest force bound by tradition. The Council established new military doctrines based on human principles and created training programs that taught adaptive thinking and unconventional tactics and encouraged commanders to question established methods and find creative solutions. And every officer candidate studied the Battle of Darkness and analyzed what went wrong and what Morrison did. Wright Morrison returned to Earth as a hero, but never spoke publicly about the war and avoided ceremonies and declined medals, and instead submitted detailed reports to Earth's military command and helped train the next generation of officers, and emphasized that their victory had come not from being better than the aliens, but from being different, The Defiant was decommissioned finally after 5 years of continuous service and placed in a museum at Nexus Station, where visitors from across the galaxy came to see the small human ship that had changed the course of history, and Morrison attended the ceremony and stood quietly as speakers praised his achievements. That night he gathered with his surviving crew at a small bar near the docking bays, and they drank and remembered those who hadn't made it home, and talked about ordinary things and avoided discussing the war because they had all seen enough and done enough, and now wanted simply to live. The galaxy had learned that the newest member of the Council and the species everyone dismissed as primitive. Newcomers understood something about warfare that thousands of years of galactic civilization had forgotten, and that sometimes the underdog won, not despite their limitations, but because of how they learned to fight with them, and humanity had proven its place among the stars forever.